Wren Ashford had 48 hours to save her mother's house, or the only home she had ever known would belong to a bank before the end of the month. She sat very still in the waiting room of Calloway and Associates, which was not a room so much as a corridor with pretensions. 2 chairs, a dying fern, and a receptionist who had not looked up once in the 20 minutes since Wren had arrived. The folder in her lap held every document she owned. The house on Galbraith Street in Halifax had been her grandmother's before it was her mother's, and her mother's for 31 years before the illness had made managing things impossible. The mortgage was 3 payments behind. The bank had sent a final notice in a cream envelope that her mother had tucked behind the flour tin in the kitchen, as if not seeing it made it not real. Wren had found it on a Sunday. She had driven 6 hours from Toronto on a Monday. She was sitting in this corridor on a Tuesday, waiting to speak to a financial restructuring specialist whose name she had found on a community legal aid board because she could not afford anyone else. The door opened. The man who came out was speaking quietly to someone on his phone. He was perhaps 35, in a dark coat that fit precisely, with the kind of composed face that had been composed for a long time and knew it. He glanced at her once, the professional assessment of a man accustomed to reading rooms, and then looked away. Wren looked away too. "Mrs. Ashford," the receptionist had finally looked up. "Mr. Thorne will see you now." The office was plain and efficient, the kind of room that had decided long ago not to waste time on personality. One window faced a grey November harbour. A potted plant on the sill was doing better than the fern outside. Behind the desk sat a man perhaps 10 years older than Wren, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a coffee mug that said, inexplicably, "Property of no one" in faded green letters. Fletcher Thorne looked at the folder she set on his desk, and then at her, with the careful attention of someone who had seen a great many folders, and understood that the person who brought them was always more complicated than what was inside. "Tell me about the house," he said. She had practiced this. She had written it out on the train. The mortgage figure, the arrears, the timeline, the options she had already tried. She sat down and she said none of it. "My mother planted a climbing rose on the east wall the year I was born," Wren said. "She trained it up the drain pipe herself. Every June it comes in burgundy. She cannot get out of bed most mornings now, but in June she moves her chair to the window and watches it." Fletcher Thorne did not reach for a pen. "I am not telling you that," Wren said, "to make it sentimental. I am telling you that because I need you to understand that there is no other outcome I'm willing to consider." A silence. Outside, a gull called once and was quiet. "How much time do we have?" he said. 48 hours before the bank files." He looked at the folder. He opened it. He read the first 2 pages in the silence of a man who read quickly and understood what he read. He set the glasses down from his forehead onto his nose and read 2 more pages. "This is," he said, "not unfixable." Wren let out a breath she had been holding since Sunday. "But it will require documentation I don't have in front of me." He closed the folder. "And it will require you to be available for the next 2 days, which I assume is not a problem since you drove 6 hours to sit in my waiting room." "I drove 6 hours," Wren said. "And I will sleep in my car if that is what it takes." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Exactly. The precursor to one carefully managed. "That won't be necessary," Fletcher said. "Come back tomorrow at 9. Bring your mother's original mortgage documents and anything in writing from the bank from the last 6 months. He paused. "And bring her power of attorney paperwork. If she signed it over, it will make this faster." "She signed it over 3 weeks ago." Wren stood. "Mr. Thorne." He looked up. "Thank you." He nodded once, the nod of a man who reserved judgment until the work was finished. She left. She saved the house. It took 19 days, 2 hearings, and 4 phone calls than she could count. But Fletcher Thorne was methodical in the way of someone who had made a private decision somewhere, early in his career, never to lose a case he believed in. Wren sat across from him in the same plain office for 6 days and watched him work, and she thought, this man has not eaten a meal that wasn't at his desk in years. On the 19th day, the bank withdrew. He called her at 7 in the evening to tell her. She was sitting on the kitchen floor of the house on Galbraith Street, with her back against the cabinet, because her mother had been having a difficult week, and there was no chair close enough to the right room. The climbing rose was bare in November, but the canes were still there, dark and patient against the brick. She said, "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You already have. I charged you my full rate." She almost laughed. It surprised her. "That's the first time you've done that," Fletcher said. "Done what?" A pause on the line. "I'll send the final documents by Thursday." He hung up. She sat on the kitchen floor for a long time afterward and looked at the bare canes of the climbing rose through the window and thought, without entirely meaning to, about a man who had not looked at the harbour once in 6 days of sitting beside a harbour-facing window. She went back to Toronto. She went back to her work, which was translation, technical, medical, legal, any language that needed crossing into another. She worked from a small apartment in the annex with a window that faced a brick wall and a cat named Bramble, who had opinions about everything. She thought about Halifax less than she expected. She thought about Fletcher Thorne more than she expected. She did not examine this too carefully. She had a habit of not examining things too carefully when they sat in the category of things that will not come to anything anyway. She had a gift for translation and a talent for recognizing when two things did not belong in the same sentence. She and Fletcher Thorne did not belong in the same sentence. He was Halifax. She was Toronto. He was measured and precise, and his office had no art on the walls because art required a decision about what mattered to you. She had art on every wall, most of it her grandmother's, most of it slightly crooked. She filed him in the category and moved on. In February, he called her Mrs. Ashford, not Wren. He had never called her Wren. "I have a situation I'd like your opinion on." "My opinion," she said, "is a translation matter." "Your opinion," he said, "is a human matter. I find myself low on those." A pause that might have been embarrassment. "My daughter is 9. She has decided she wants to stop speaking English." Wren waited. "She is speaking only French, exclusively, for the past 3 weeks." Another pause. "I speak passable French. It is apparently not passable enough. She told me last Tuesday that my accent makes her sad." This time Wren did laugh. She heard him exhale on the other end. Not quite a laugh. "You speak French," he said. "I looked at your credentials. You speak 6 languages." 7, Wren said, "if you count the dialect my grandmother used, which 3 people in the world still speak." 7, Fletcher said. "My daughter would like to meet you, Mr. Thorne." She stopped. She did not know what she was about to say. "Her name is Bea," he said quietly. "She is 9 years old, and she has decided that French is the only language in which she can fully express herself, and I have not been able to find out why, and I would like to." Wren was quiet for a moment. Outside, a branch scraped the window. Bramble walked across the desk and sat on the keyboard. "All right," she said. She drove back to Halifax on a Thursday. Bea Thorne was 9 years old, small for her age, with her father's composure and a gap between her front teeth and a library of approximately 40 French picture books arranged in strict alphabetical order on a shelf above her desk. She regarded Wren from the doorway of her bedroom with the measuring look of a child who had been meeting adults her whole life and found most of them disappointing. Wren said in careful Quebecois, "Your father told me your accent makes him sad." Bea's face cracked open. She laughed, a real surprised laugh, nothing managed about it. "It really does," she said, also in French. "He sounds like a textbook." "He sounds like the textbook from 1987, Wren agreed. "Come on, show me the shelf." They spent 2 hours on the floor of Bea's room going through the books. Wren translated the untranslatable parts, the jokes that only made sense in French, the puns that lost their shape crossing over. Bea had a precise, serious mind that latched onto language the way a lock latches onto the right key. She had a question about every page. From the door once, Wren was aware of Fletcher standing and watching them, and she felt the awareness the way you feel a cold draft. Not uncomfortable, just present, informing the room. She stayed for dinner. This had not been the plan. Fletcher had made pasta, slightly overcooked, with a concentrated focus of aim-for meals, and had stopped apologizing for it. "It's fine," Wren said. "It's overcooked," he said. "I wasn't being polite. I genuinely don't mind overcooked pasta." He looked at her across the table the way he had looked at the mortgage folder on the first day, not assessing, exactly. More like trying to determine which category something belonged in, and finding that the categories he had available were insufficient. Bea was talking about a book. She was talking to Wren as though Wren had always been at this table, as though this were not a Thursday in February when all of them had arrived here by a series of accidents and obligations. She talked with her hands. She switched between French and English without seeming to notice. "She's doing it," Fletcher said quietly, while Bea went to get the book. "Doing what?" "Mixing. She stopped mixing in October. She chose one language and stayed in it." He set his fork down. "I didn't know until this evening that the mixing was back." Wren thought about this. Did something happen in October? He was quiet for a moment. Then her mother moved to Vancouver. Wren did not say anything. She understood in the way that people who translate understand. Sometimes a language is not a language. Sometimes it is the thing left standing when everything else has gone, and you hold it because it is the shape of something you cannot name out loud. She wanted a language that was completely hers, Wren said. Something her mother hadn't given her and you hadn't given her. Something she chose alone. Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. Bea came back with the book. They did not speak of it again that evening. But when Wren left at 9 o'clock, Fletcher walked her to the door and said, without the managed distance he usually kept between himself and direct statements, "Thank you. Not for the translation. For the other thing." "I didn't do anything," Wren said. "She already knew." "She knew," he said. "She needed someone who spoke the language to confirm it." Wren drove to her mother's house and sat in the kitchen under the bare overhead light and thought about what it meant to speak someone's language. Not the words, the structure underneath them. The thing that makes meaning possible. She stayed in Halifax for a week. She told herself it was because her mother needed her. This was true. It was not the only true thing. She came back in March, and then again in April. Each time, she told Bramble and the brick wall and herself that this was about her mother, who was better some weeks and worse others, who had begun to sit in the garden in the afternoons when the weather allowed, watching the climbing rose put out its first small leaves. In March, she had dinner with Fletcher and Bea on a Tuesday. In April, she had dinner with them on a Thursday, and Bea had asked her to help with a school project about the Acadian deportation, which had led to a 4-hour conversation that ended at 11 at night when Bea fell asleep at the table and had to be carried to bed. Fletcher came back downstairs and found Wren washing the dishes, which had not been asked of her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He stood at the counter with a dish towel and dried what she washed, and they did not talk for a while, which was, Wren thought, an oddly comfortable thing for two people who barely knew each other. Silence usually required familiarity. This one seemed to have arrived early. "Can I ask you something?" Fletcher said. "Yes. Why translation? You could have studied law. Or medicine. Your analytical mind. You would have been good at either." She handed him a glass. "My grandmother spoke a language that had no standardized written form. When she died, I was the last person in my family who could speak it. I realize there are entire worlds that disappear when the last person who speaks them is gone." She paused. "I translate because I am afraid of things disappearing." He dried the glass very carefully. "What are you afraid of disappearing, Fletcher?" she said. She had called him by his first name without deciding to. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I'm afraid," he said at last, "of Bea growing up and finding that I was the textbook from 1987. Present, correct, insufficient." Wren looked at him. He was looking at the window above the sink, where the backyard was dark and the first rain of April was starting. "You're not," she said. "You've known me for 3 months. I've known you for 3 months, and in that time you called a translator in Toronto, because your daughter chose a language you couldn't follow her into, and you stood in her doorway on a Thursday evening, watching her laugh for the first time in 4 months. That is not the textbook. That is the father." He turned to look at her then. It was the honest look, the kind the surgeon candidate had described in the video Wren had never seen, but that existed independently in all the small, accurate ways people looked at each other when they stopped performing. She felt it land. She turned back to the sink and handed him the last glass. In May, her mother had a bad week. Wren came down on a Wednesday and did not leave until Sunday. On the Thursday of that week, Bea appeared at the door of the house on Galbraith Street with a Tupperware container of slightly overcooked pasta and a note in French that said, in the careful handwriting of a 9-year-old, "My father says you are staying too long alone. He cannot come himself because of a hearing. He sent this instead. Also, I wanted to see." Wren stood at the door with the Tupperware and the note and felt something move in her chest that she had been successfully keeping still for 3 months. She called Fletcher that evening. "You sent Bea," she said. "Spaulding," he said. "I mentioned you were here, and she was out the door in 4 minutes. She said you sent her. She has a gift for creative translation," Fletcher said. "She gets it from someone." Wren was quiet. Her mother was asleep in the next room. The rose outside was in bud, not yet open, holding all its color back for June. "Fletcher." A pause. "Is this?" She stopped. She didn't know how to ask what she meant to ask. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I have been trying to determine that since February, and I have found that my usual method of analysis is not particularly useful here." His voice was careful but not distant. "I keep arriving at conclusions that require more information than I have." "What kind of information?" "The kind," Fletcher said, "that requires you to be in the same room as me, which has become, I've noticed, considerably more complicated by the fact that you live in Toronto." Wren looked at the rose canes in the dark. "I grew up in this house," she said. "Halifax is." She stopped again. "I know," he said again, more quietly. They stayed on the line for a long time without speaking. Outside, the climbing rose held its buds against the dark. In the next room, her mother breathed steadily in sleep. In a house across the city, a 9-year-old was probably still awake, reading in French by flashlight and listening to whatever silence sounded like when two people were being honest through it. "I'll come for dinner on Sunday," Wren said finally, "before I drive back." "All right," Fletcher said. "I will not overcook the pasta. You can overcook the pasta," she said. "I've told you that. I know. I wanted to try something different," she almost said. "That's enough, Fletcher." That right there. She didn't. She said goodnight and sat with her phone in her hand in the quiet kitchen and let herself, for the first time, sit in the truth of it without immediately filing it somewhere else. Sunday dinner became a habit, not every Sunday, but enough of them that Bayer began setting 3 places without being asked, and enough of them that Fletcher stopped asking whether she wanted coffee and simply made it the way she took it, which was black with 1 spoonful of honey, which he had noticed in February and remembered in May, and had never commented on until the evening in June when Wren came for dinner, and her mother came too. For the first time, because it had been a good week, and there had been a good June, and the climbing rose had come in exactly as burgundy as promised. Her mother's name was Elspeth. She was 63 years old and had the kind of stillness that long illness gives some people and takes from others. A stillness that had become in her, a kind of attention. She watched things. She noticed. She noticed Fletcher pour Wren's coffee at the end of dinner. She noticed Bee lean against Wren's shoulder while they looked at something on Bee's phone. She noticed Fletcher watching this and looking, for a man who had been composed for a long time, unexpectedly unguarded. On the drive home, Elspeth said nothing for several blocks. "Then he's careful." "He is," Wren agreed. "Careful men take longer," her mother said, "but they don't go back on it." Wren did not answer. She watched the Halifax streets go by and thought about a man who had spent October to May driving his daughter to a school where the teachers couldn't follow her French and had not asked her to come back to English, had only found someone who spoke what she needed to hear. In July, Wren's contract with a Toronto medical firm ended and was not renewed. This was not a catastrophe. She had other work, smaller and more scattered, and she had been thinking for some time about whether Toronto was still the right answer to a question she'd stopped asking clearly. But it meant that when August arrived, and her mother had another bad week, the reason for staying in Halifax was less a reason and more an acknowledgement of something that had already shifted. She did not call Fletcher to tell him this. He found out because Bay told him that Wren's boxes were in the garage on Galbraith Street, which Bay knew because she had gone to visit on a Saturday with her French homework and helped carry 3 of them. He appeared at the door on a Sunday evening with a bottle of wine he had clearly spent some time selecting, because it was from a small Nova Scotia vineyard rather than the general-purpose Shiraz he usually brought, and this was the kind of detail that meant something, when the man in question was someone who communicated in details because the direct route made him nervous. "Bee told you," Wren said. "Bee tells me everything," Fletcher said, "when she feels I need to know it and am too slow to find out myself." Wren stepped back from the door. He came in. Her mother was having dinner with a friend. The house was quiet. The climbing rose was past its peak now, the burgundy going to rose going to blush at the edges, the last of the summer holding. They opened the wine and sat at the kitchen table. And Fletcher said, without preamble, which was how Wren had come to understand he said the things that mattered, "I would like to stop pretending that Sunday dinners are a casual arrangement." Wren looked at her glass. "I'm aware," he said, "that I am not easy. I am aware that I spent the better part of a decade making myself efficient and contained, because that was what the work required and what the years required, and I have not been in the habit of undoing it." He paused. "Bee has been undoing it since she was born. You have been undoing it since February without, I think, intending to." "I wasn't trying to," Wren said. "I know. That was rather the point." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know how to do this slowly, Wren. I have been trying to do it slowly, because it seemed like the right thing. But I find that slow, in this particular case, has its own costs." She had been waiting for this, she realized. Not waiting the way you wait for something you want, but waiting the way you wait for the translation to arrive. The moment when all the words you have been holding separately finally resolve into a sentence that means what it was always going to mean. "My mother needs me here," she said. "I'm not leaving Halifax again." A pause. "I don't want to." "I know," Fletcher said. "I had accounted for that." "You accounted for it." "I have been working through the relevant factors since approximately the 3rd Sunday dinner," he said. "I was thorough." She looked at him across the kitchen table of her grandmother's house in the last of the August evening light, and she thought, this is not a man performing. This is a man who prepared for this conversation the way he prepares for a hearing, which is to say carefully and with full attention, because he does not begin anything he does not intend to finish. She put her hand on the table between them. He put his over it. It was not dramatic. The rose outside did not suddenly open. No one played music. Her mother did not come home to a convenient moment. It was simply a kitchen table, and two people who had been translating each other for 8 months and had finally found the sentence underneath all the other sentences. "You're going to have to let me rearrange your office," she said. "What's wrong with my office? There's no art on the walls." Fletcher was quiet. "I never knew what I liked," he said. "That's all right," Wren said. "I have enough for both of us." Outside, the climbing rose moved slightly in the evening wind, the way it had been moving since before Wren was born, the canes patient against the brick, holding the shape of everything that had grown along them. In September, Wren's mother came back from a Thursday appointment and said, over dinner, that Dr. Ose had told her the scan results were better than expected, that whatever had been progressing had, for reasons no one could fully explain, slowed. She said this quietly, the way Elspeth said things that mattered, and then she reached over and poured herself a second cup of tea, which she rarely did, and said nothing else about it. Wren reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's. Neither of them spoke. In October, Wren put 3 pieces of her grandmother's art on the walls of Fletcher's office, slightly crooked, which he accepted without comment, and then, on a Tuesday afternoon when he thought she wasn't looking, took a photograph of, presumably to look at later and consider at length, which was how Fletcher Thorne did most of his considering. Bea, who had been watching this transaction from the doorway, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had arranged a complex maneuver and was pleased with the result, went back to her homework. In November, the rose canes were bare again against the east wall of the house on Galbraith Street. On a Sunday evening, Wren stood at the kitchen window looking at them, and Fletcher came to stand beside her and they watched the bare canes together in the early dark. "She planted it the year you were born," he said. "She did. What kind?" "Cardinal de Richelieu," Wren said. "Old French garden rose. Blooms once. Burgundy in June, once a year, she said. But it's always burgundy." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That seems like enough." "It is," she said. "It always has been." Bramble, relocated from Toronto with strong opinions about the move and a detailed complaint lodged every morning between 4 and 6, jumped up onto the kitchen counter and regarded them both with the weary authority of someone who had been present at the beginning of all of this and expected to be acknowledged. Fletcher scratched him once behind the ear. Bramble head-butted his hand and settled. The house on Galbraith Street had people and 1 cat in it now, on a Sunday in November, with the heat running and the kettle on, and a 9-year-old in the next room, reading in French and occasionally shouting vocabulary questions through the wall. It was not quiet. It was not efficient. It was the kind of ordinary that requires years to build without knowing you are building it. Wren stood at the window and watched the bare rose canes and thought, "I have been translating all my life. This is the first sentence I have not had to cross into another language. This one arrived already in mine.